Now we've gone through a lot of information about valid arguments, valid patterns of arguments, how you evaluate arguments, what makes arguments good arguments. But as I said, we've only dealt with a very limited number of inferences, of valid inferences. What do we do if we encounter one that does not fit a pattern? Let's consider an example to help explain how we're going to have to deal with that. Let's say you come across the following argument. All communists are opposed to capitalism. Jones is opposed to capitalism, therefore Jones is a communist. Now, that should say this argument valid? Does it follow one of the valid patterns? Let me just fix the slide while we're talking. Is this argument okay? And you can go through. It says it's all P's or all A's are B's. X is a B, therefore X is an A. That is not one of our valid patterns. But from the fact that it's not one of our valid patterns, we cannot infer that it's not a valid inference. But there's a way that we actually can prove that it's a valid inference, that it's invalid, so that we know that there's a problem with the logic, and it's called the method of counterexamples. This one I mentioned when we went through the inferences about all and some. The problem that this one is problematic, that this is not it's a fallacy. But here's how you'd go about proving it. And the way you'd prove it is that what you want to do in a valid argument, we know that it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusions false. So if we're going to try to prove something is not valid, we have to ask ourselves, can we imagine a possible world, and I'll explain that in a second, in which all the premises are true and the conclusion is false? Can we actually do that? And let me just explain this possible world. Imagine a possible world, and that's about equivalent to describe a situation, describe a world without contradicting oneself, and in which the premises are true and the conclusions false. Well, can we describe a situation in which all communists are opposed to capitalism, Jones is opposed to capitalism, but the conclusion for Jones is not a communist? Well, we can imagine a situation in which there are people that we'll call them not communists, but familyists, who aren't communists, who don't share all of Marx's premises, but think because of family relations, you have to take certain economic steps. And Jones is one of these familyists. So Jones is opposed to capitalism, right? Because he feels he needs to help family do whatever he can for his family. But so from the fact that all communists are opposed to capitalism, because that's what Marx tells us, that's what Marxists, the communists, claim, Jones is opposed to capitalism because he's a familyist. He is not a communist because familyists, as I'm calling my made-up term, are not communists. So what we've done is describe a possible situation. That is, we've described, without contradicting ourselves, a situation in which those premises are true and the conclusion is false. So notice we've learned about how to find a counterexample to prove invalidity, and we have this concept of possible worlds, which kind of defines what's possible and what's not possible. And we see that what's possible is what you can describe without contradicting yourself. If you contradict yourself, you're describing something that's impossible. To give you an example of something that's impossible, a round square. That is not, in no possible world are there round squares, because something's being round by itself means that it's not square. So you contradict yourself by doing that. So we've gone through now what makes good arguments, and we're going to spend some time. I suggest, if you haven't done so already, sit down and go through the examples and go and try to give yourself paradigm examples of the valid inferences. In addition to which, I'm going to ask you to consider a few exercises to reinforce these concepts.